Welcome, everybody. Good morning to those who are in California or on the West Coast. Good afternoon to people on the East Coast. Jonathan, Stephen, not Stephen, right? It's Jonathan and Jack in the East Coast. And good evening to those in Europe, like Stephen, or those in Asia. I think we've got quite a global audience here today. So welcome to this dissertation defense of Jonathan Kay. Jonathan's dissertation is titled The Integrative Impulse as Dark Precursor of Sonocultural Transindividuation, an Autoethnographic Apprenticeship to Musical Signs. And before we start, I'd like to introduce Jonathan's committee to everybody. So the external committee member, Jonathan's external committee member is Dr. Stephen Zepke. Dr. Zepke is an independent researcher based in Vienna. He works between philosophy, modern and contemporary art, and politics. His recent books include Towards a New Brutalism, Wandering Around Robin Hood Gardens. Another one is Head in the Stars, Essays on Science Fiction, and a volume in Spanish, I suppose, La Sensación Más Allá de los Límites, Ensayos sobre Arte y Política, and Sublime Art Towards an Aesthetics of the Future. And finally, Violence and Resistance, Art and Politics in Colombia. So these are his recent works, but I'd like to mention that one of the reasons that Stephen is here is he's one of, I would say, one of the foremost scholars in Deleuze and Guattari in our times. The second member on Jonathan's committee is Professor Jack Bagby. Dr. Bagby is Assistant Professor of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness at CIIS. He has been studying philosophy and ancient Greek language at Pennsylvania State University and received his doctorate in philosophy at Boston College. His research focuses on Henri Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, and the history of philosophy from a process perspective. He has publications in Epoche, Process Studies, and the British Journal for the Society of Phenomenology. More relevant to today's defense, Jack has taught classes on Gilles Deleuze, Baruch Spinoza, the philosophy of music and aesthetics. He is a musician and composer and has been collaborating with Jonathan musically and philosophically for almost 3 years. And finally, I am chairing the committee. I'm Devashish Banerjee, Haridas Chaudhuri, Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures, and Doshi Professor of Asian Art at CIIS. I also am the chair of East-West Psychology and its Asian Contemplative and Transcultural Studies concentration. I work in the areas of culture studies, post-colonialism, and post-humanism. My major influences include Sri Aurobindo, Henri Bergson, Deleuze and Guattari, and Gilbert Simondon. My most recent monograph is Time Steps of the Cosmic Horse, the Contemplative Philosophy of the Great Forest Upanishad, and my most recent co-edited volume is Post-Humanism and India, a Critical Cartography. So with that, I'd like to give a little bit of a, the way this defense is going to proceed. We'll turn it over to Jonathan, and Jonathan will present his dissertation. He will speak to us for about an hour. After that, we will go through a couple of rounds of questions with the committee members and a conversation around those questions. And if time permits, then we'll have a third round in which the audience can also participate. After that, we'll enter into a a private room to discuss the dissertation and come back with the results of the defense. So unless there are any other questions from the committee members or from Jonathan, I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Debashish. I'll just share my screen and get going here. One sec. Make sure I did that correctly. Yes, I did. Okay. And I'm just confirming that everybody can see that.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we see it.
Fantastic. Okay, well, it's an honor to be sitting here before you presenting my work. Before I start, I'd like to thank my committee, Debashish, for your unwavering mentorship, and Jack and Stephen for your support in this research. I'd also like to say that the pictures shared here reflect the autoethnographic journey, and the original art that you'll see is from a variety of artists that I have collaborated with over the years. The only exception being illustrations by Marc Negui, which are set to Deleuze-Guattari's work, A Thousand Plateaus, which has been an important resource and inspiration in this type of research. So this dissertation investigates how sonic arts participate in world making amid the profound cultural exhaustion of the capital O scene. In this era of algorithmic and computational capture, we are witnessing what Bernard Stiegler calls an epoch without an epoch, a temporal disjunction in which the conditions of collective individuation collapse under the weight of technological acceleration and epistemic closure. I approach this crisis not only as an external breakdown of systems, but also as the internalization of inherited modes of subjectivity. I focus on Western humanism and post-Enlightenment modernity, which continue to overdetermine subject formation and the social context of artistic production. The sonic arts are central to this inquiry. Historically, musical and aesthetic practices have served as vehicles for countercultural transformation. Today, neoliberal capitalism has largely enclosed the arts within circuits of spectacle and market value. Reflecting on my experience with jazz, for example, a tradition once alive with revolutionary force, I explore how musics have been commodified and neutralized. Against this, I propose that experimental, improvisational, and contemplative musical practices that do not merely express, but are ontologically transformative, opening one to the outside of oneself, depositing ruptural signs, or evoking cosmic forces. Yet this autoethnography revolves around a central realization. Ontological transformation must be addressed at both the individual and collective level, through personal metamorphosis and the transformation of social conditions of action. This research explores the role of the sonic arts in our times by autoethnographically tracing ruptural musical events and formative singularities in my life with four main intentions: to examine how these ruptural events intervene in my becoming, to critique the cultural and epistemic infrastructures that condition the context of these ruptures, to situate such events within genealogies of sonic resistance responding to broader collective impasses, and to explore the place of these events in catalyzing alternative social ontologies in response to the problematics of contemporary world making. These objectives revolve around intuiting a hidden problematic of becoming of our times, which, using Gilles Deleuze's terminology, I see as a dark precursor. And the objectives aim to respond to this dark precursor through an intuitive process, which I see as a Deleuzian apprenticeship to science. The aim of such an apprenticeship is the relational individuation of making a world adequate to the problematic, a process that Gilbert Simondon refers to as transindividuation. I theorize that the response of adequacy to such a problematic is guided by an integrative impulse. Thus, the guiding question that orients this inquiry is: how does an integrative impulse, understood as a dark precursor of contemporary becoming, express itself as a search for a habitus of transindividuation within an individuating apprenticeship to science? The main theoretical framework is composed of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's integral yoga as a practice of revolutionary spirituality enriched by Banerjee's integral yoga psychology and post-human creativity. Gilbert Simondon's notions of transindividuation and individuation, and the critical and creative philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Each lens offers a partial perspective on my autoethnographic apprenticeship to science, contributing to an understanding of the larger historical problematic of modernity. Rather than remaining within a cross-cultural comparative framework, this research moves towards a trans or heterocultural praxical orientation, an experimental engagement with how these lenses can be creatively used to overcome epistemic closures and open towards more ethical social praxis in our globalized times. This dissertation positions the scholar-artist not as a synthesizer of disciplines, but as an operator within collisions between sonic practice and philosophical inquiry. Aesthetic praxis becomes a method for thinking and practicing integrally. Galope notes that music, which, quote, lacks semantic elements, remains permanently unresolved and ambiguous, suspended between the magnetic powers of affect and the structuring powers of cognition. End quote. Rather than rendering music legible to theory, aesthetic praxis allows music to generate thought, what I call musical individuation, where sonic experience is not interpreted but becomes a source of concepts, intuition, and problematics. As Galope writes, such practice carries the atmospheric weight of aesthetic praxis, saturated by structure and ideas. This is especially salient in my work with jazz, raga, and shakuhachi music traditions that resist assimilation into Eurocentric epistemologies and operate as non-Western subjectivities and divergent modes of worlding. As such, this research is best situated within the academic field of posthumanism, which critiques the ontology and epistemology of European humanism, and, as Ferrando writes, quote, exceeds the particular tradition of Western academic thought, and it can be traced and enacted in different cultures as well as in different modes, end quote. According to Banerjee, humanism is a Western historical construct that, in the aftermath of colonialism, has become epistemically global. Yet it can be exceeded, transformed through its, quote, other historical and cultural definitions of the human. While the modern academy is coextensive with humanism, it is also undergoing a process of self-critique and transformation. This evolving horizon defines the post-humanist terrain in which my research is situated. So while individuation is often associated with C.G. Jung as a psychological emergence of singular personhood from the amorphous unconscious towards universal integration, thinkers like Simondon and Deleuze offer an ontological reconfiguration. For Simondon, individuation is not the realization of a pre-existing self, but the processual negotiation of tensions within a pre-individual metastable field of differential relations, giving rise to form through relational and affective dynamics. I understand my life as a practice of musical individuation, an experimental mode of self-making that I come to realize is always also collective. Here, sonic arts do not merely express identity, but function as sound force of cultural revolution and shared aspirations for a new future. This leads to the problematic of transindividuation, the process through which individual and collective individuation enter into a reciprocal and constitutive relation. Simondon defines the transindividual as, quote, the systematic unity of interior, which is psychic, individuation, and exterior, which is collective individuation. This relation is a transductive exchange, a dynamic operation which energy is actualized across heterogeneous series, moving between states to individuate new materialities. Transduction, Simondon insists, is not, quote, merely the reasoning of the mind, but it is also intuition, through which a structure appears in a domain of a problematic as providing the resolution to the problems posed, end quote. At the heart of this process is a shift from ontology to ontogenesis. Ontogenesis refers to the unfolding of individuation itself, the dynamic genesis of the individual, whether physical, biological, psychic, or collective. As Simondon writes, ontogenesis is, quote, grasping the genesis of the individuals within the operation of individuation as it is unfolding, end quote. Drawing from Teilhard de Chardin and Banerjee, I situate ontogenesis within a broader arc of cosmogenesis. Cosmogenesis does not refer to a single past event or fixed totality, but the ongoing emergence and differentiation of the universe, a processual worlding in which each being participates. It is both the condition of ontogenesis and its horizon. The cosmos is not prior to the individual, it emerges with and through it. Ontogenesis is always cosmogenetic, and the cosmos is always individuating. Through autoethnographic analysis, I will interrogate how our times constitutes a historically conditioned problematic and how ruptural events have functioned as dark precursors, invisible, indeterminate forces that precede conscious understanding and initiate communication between otherwise disconnected series. As Deleuze writes, thunderbolts explode between different intensities, but they are preceded by an invisible, imperceptible dark precursor, which determines their path in advance but in reverse, as though entangulated. Each system contains its dark precursor, which ensures the communication of a peripheral series. End quote. These events operate through resonance, modulation, and coupling, producing what Deleuze calls forced movements that restructure subjectivity and perception. The dark precursor, quote, stands for this totality in which all levels coexist, end quote. In these ruptures, signs flash between different intensities, inaugurating new capacities for thought and action. It was through Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga that I found a practical framework for addressing the psychic and cultural fragmentation symptomatic of modernity. Through Banerjee's interpretation, I came to see these conditions as containing a deeper immanent force he names the integrative impulse. Banerjee writes, modernity, with its world-spanning ambitions, both contains the world and fragments it into regions and cultures, creating an inevitable global condition. This in itself opens up the condition for a historical horizon for the release of the plural as radical expressions of univocity. The impulse towards such a plane is therefore immanent in modernity as the integrative impulse. End quote. These events shaped what I have come to understand as an apprenticeship to science, a process guided not by mastery or synthesis, but by the nonlinear emergence of new ontological and collective configurations. Each dark precursor disclosed a new problematic field. The integrative impulse became an orientation of these movements, compelling resonance across psychic multiplicities, as well as social, cultural, and cosmic orders. So this forms the theoretical framework in which I'll explore transindividuation. From this diagram, we can see how I conceive of the transindividual as the reciprocal determination of ontogenesis and cosmogenesis. Banerjee's development of the concept of the transindividual becomes crucial here, not as a predetermined endpoint, but what he calls a vanishing point, a speculative horizon of becoming that can only be experienced integrally. He writes, such a transindividual cannot be named or known until integrally experienced. In our times, the collective attractor of such an ideal is the vanishing point that may be called the plane of immanence, whose philosophical definition is the identity of radical plurality and absolute unity, working together in a polis of the future that supports an ethos and interpretation of forming unique individual and collective becomings towards the embodiment of such a transindividual is the imagination of the unthought within the thought of our times. While this autoethnography spans decades, the point at which I entered academic work lies near its culmination. It is through this theoretical framework that I have come to better understand the forces that shaped my trajectory, not as linear causes necessarily, but as signs drawn towards future attractors. These concepts have allowed me not only to interpret my past, but to reorient my becomings towards the imagination of the unthought. This dissertation develops a methodology grounded in autoethnography, reconfigured through Deleuze's concept of an apprenticeship to science. Yet, autoethnography, as both a process and product, allows for the articulation of liminal and subjective dimensions of experience that often escape the constraints of conventional research. Rather than beginning with fixed axioms, I follow Deleuze's insight that, quote, something in the world forces us to think, end quote. That true learning emerges through ruptural encounters. As he writes, learning is essentially concerned with signs. Signs are the object of a temporal apprenticeship, not of an abstract knowledge. Every act of learning is an interpretation of signs or hieroglyphs. Each rupture in my musical life functioned as an encounter with what Deleuze calls the outside, a force that interrupts recognition, destabilizes identity, and compels transformation. These sonic encounters did not merely disrupt habitual configurations of thought, they reoriented subjectivity and revealed the self not as stable interiority, but as a site of ongoing deconstruction and reconfiguration. As Deleuze writes, what the outside describes in the first place is the relationship of force with force. These signs were not representational markers, but ontogenetic catalysts, intensities that set thought in motion and generated new affective and conceptual territories. Some have emerged with immediate force, others remained latent, awaiting future resonance. This autoethnography then becomes a sonic cartography, an unfolding diagram of how following signs gives rise to new problematics, new senses, new inventions, and even new visions of collectivity. This autoethnography unfolds across 5 phases, each tracing a distinct problematic field encountered within my journey. Each phase is composed through a recursive structure, a context of individuation, an intuitive goal of becoming, a rupture, a refrain, and an expressive sonic act. Each phase begins not with a pre-given concept, but a goal of becoming, what Banerjee calls an aspiration to the will to power. These aspirations arise as intuitive and creative responses to culturally and psychically situated problematics that demand transformation. This process unfolds as a dynamic circuit of becoming. First, a goal emerges from within the self as a creative response to one's conditions. Second, this aspiration leads to the discovery or construction of metaphysical and psychological frameworks capable of supporting such transformative processes. And third, these frameworks coalesce into a praxeology, a concrete lived praxis through which the goal of becoming can be actualized. At the core of each phase is a ruptural event, an encounter with the outside, and an intensity that scrambles inherited coordinates and deposits a sign. This reorganization culminates in what Deleuze and Guattari call a refrain, quote, any aggregate of matters of expression that draws a territory, end quote. The refrain is an expressive constellation of gestural, sonic, and affective elements that gives rhythm and consistency to a newly inhabited territory. It is not a return to order, but a temporary rhythm of dwelling that may stabilize, mutate, or dissolve. The refrain allows one to inhabit a new existential terrain, giving form to emergent subjectivities while always carrying the potential to deterritorialize towards what they name the cosmic refrain of a sound machine. Over the course of my apprenticeship, my aesthetic praxis turned toward experimental improvisation, a search for the conditions of the unknown and unforeseeable, a practice of folding in the outside. Within this practice, I term aleatory points, those singular events that compel movement beyond intention, disrupt linear time, and force improvisation into new territory. Drawn towards the unknowable, they mark breaks in continuity, thresholds where sense falters and latent potentials surge. More than narrative hinges, aleatory points function as metaphysical operators, folding past intensities and future virtualities into the present as inflections of the integrative impulse, moments of expression and redirection. They become experiential anchors, invoking Deleuze's usage of the notion ion, a temporal field where time suspends its chronology and opens onto eternity in time. Deleuze aligns this with the dice roll, a chance event that opens to the unknown, stating, an aleatory point is displaced through all the points on the dice, as though one time for all times. From this perspective, the aleatory point is an event which conditions all new possibility. Okay. So each refrain carried me through this process, from territory to rupture to rhythm to an aleatory line of flight. Rather than functioning as a linear narrative, these phases form a non-chronological topology of emergence, a living diagram I call a mandala of becoming. A mandala of becoming is not a symbol of wholeness, but a transductive constellation of ruptures, refrains, and sonic experiments. This mandala does not synthesize, but resonates. In short, this research traces how rupture opens a field, how refrain shapes the passage, and how sonic praxis becomes a speculative cartography of transformation, not a map not of identity, but of becoming. And quickly here, we'll see a synopsis of the phases of the autoethnography, from the phase to its refrain, each one being a chapter in the dissertation. Okay, so part 4, the apprenticeship to signs. Institutionalized closures, the revolutionary outside, and the limits of cross-cultural creativity. So phase 1 of the autoethnography traces how my early musical subjectivity was shaped within the institutionalized framework of jazz education at Humber College in Toronto. Here, jazz was presented mostly as a technical, quite rationalized and codified language, divorced from its Black American, revolutionary, and countercultural origins. This pedagogy shaped by the logic of compatible with the logic of the culture industries, emphasized reproduction over invention, sight over sound, technique over spirit, and individual achievement over collective transformation. I excelled within this system as a good student, unconsciously internalizing its neoliberal assumptions about professionalization, self-development, and artistic value. Creativity within this context was sometimes framed as a professional and marketable skill set, an aesthetic product of cosmopolitan cultural capital rather than a vehicle for spiritual or political transformation. As such, my early musical practice reflected the conditions of cultural reproduction, producing a technically proficient but ideologically constrained output. The drive to find my own voice, a formative trope, especially in Black jazz history, was extracted from its roots and rather shaped within a white neoliberal parameters, which in retrospect amplified the desire for individual recognition and commercial success. So in the midst of a jam session, something broke open. Immersed in the flow of the music, I felt the structures I had been trained to rely on to give way. Thought dissolved into sensation. It wasn't control or technique that carried me, but a surge, an involuntary propulsion. My body moved with the music, but I was no longer directing it. I wasn't playing it. I was being played. In that moment, I didn't shape the sound, I became it. So this experience transformed me forever and ultimately opened me to a new encounter with the later works of John Coltrane. His music, particularly A Love Supreme, reoriented my aesthetic praxis entirely. In Coltrane, I heard not expression, but invocation, music as a cosmological and spiritual operator, not reducible to form, genre, or technique. His trajectory constituted an embrace of music as a practice of becoming universal, of attaining sound to planetary, ancestral, and divine forces. These sonic explorations were not merely stylistic evolutions. In the history of jazz, they marked a shift to music as a sonic ritual invoking cosmic forces. In my life, Coltrane functioned as a refrain, a rhythmic and melodic force that invited me to recompose myself. His music did not merely inspire me anymore, it refracted my desire, transposing it onto a spiritual and cosmological plane. He was not anymore a figure to emulate, but a call to deterritorialize, to find the outside of oneself, outside of one's instrument, outside of one's music genre, and even outside of one's cultural inheritance, to harness the forces of nature towards the good of humanity. Moved by Coltrane's profound engagement with Indian spiritual and music traditions, I traveled to Calcutta with my brother Andrew and our friend Justin, seeking non-Western pathways of musical becoming. This encounter reshaped me. When we returned home, charged with new ideas and intensities, we formed a band called Monsoon. This marked my first deep engagement with a non-Western culture and opened a portal into new possibilities of cross-cultural creativity. So I will turn to Stalling and his cultural framework to make sense of my relation with other cultures throughout this dissertation. The musical fragment we are about to hear, titled The Great Mandala, was composed after my first trip to India. It exemplifies my initial approach to intercultural practice. It embodies a form of cross-cultural confluence, which, following Stalling's diagram here, operates through the partial overlap of distinct, bounded systems, what he terms Category C, a hybrid space defined by shared legibility and recognition. In this model, raga and jazz musics remain conceptually autonomous. Their intersection generates hybrid forms of creativity. While such synthesis offers surface innovation, it risks epistemic reduction, reframing the other in terms already intelligible to the self. In so doing, it often evades ontological rupture, maintaining humanist presumptions of rationality and coherence, and it also risks logics of appropriation. So the Great Mandala, in retrospect, marks both a creative synthesis and a structural limit. It gestures towards aesthetic transformation, but remains bound within recognizable categories of intercultural exchange. In this way, it signaled the necessity of a deeper encounter with the music of India. In this clip, we're going to hear me playing soprano sax in a piece I composed, which was inspired by an Indian raga, the structure of an Indian raga called Gujari Todi. Okay, sorry, no nice fade outs on this in this program. So phase 2, rag deities, sonal rituals, and the emergence of transcultural creativity. So phase 2 unfolds as an apprenticeship in raga music, learned as sadhana, a spiritual praxis. What began as a cross-cultural project soon revealed the limits of additive or comparative approaches to cultural exchange. Entering the Guru Shishya Parampara, my inherited image of thought, shaped by humanist assumptions of rationality, universality, and autonomous agency, began to unravel. A raga is not merely a scale, but a living presence, a consciousness, a deity. It resisted the representational closures of cognition and opened a new field of aesthetic and spiritual individuation in my life. In the collision between my conditioned frameworks and the demands of raga sadhana, a new problematic emerged. How to approach raga not as an object of knowledge, but as an operator of a psychocosmological becoming. Deleuze's notion of the dogmatic image of thought helps illuminate my own epistemological closures. My early engagements were shaped by habits of recognition, analogy, and resemblance. Attempts to reduce Indian music and its metaphysical context to familiar categories. This image of thought assumes that concepts have intrinsic identities and that thought must form a rational coherence. Yet, the deeper I entered Rag Sadhana, the more I encountered paradoxes and aporias that forced a shift from translation to transformation. This displacement marked a turn from cognition to what I call aesthetic intuition, an effective mode of intuitive knowing that foregrounds transformation through a new perception of integral seeing hearing, known in Indian spiritual traditions as darshan. Over the course of a decade living in India, I encountered numerous ruptural events. During performances in city temples and remote village jungles, I felt the dissolution of the self into the raga deity. These were not moments of performance in the conventional sense, but spiritual saturations, thresholds where the subject-object divide collapsed. In these moments, sounds ceased to be expressions and became prayer, a site of ontogenesis through becoming raga. Driven by the desire to more authentically express raga on the saxophone, I began experimenting, an inquiry that led to the innovation of the Shrutiphone, a customized saxophone adapted to raga tuning systems. This marked a decisive refrain in this phase, opening to a new creative field within my aesthetic praxis. Playing the Shrutiphone required a transductive coupling with the instrument, transforming the subject-object relation into a site of experimental co-individuation. It was not merely a tool to be mastered, but a new being in an evolving technical system. The Shrutiphone thus became a cosmotechnical invention. Yuk Hui defines cosmotechnics as, quote, the unification of moral order and cosmic order through technical activities, end quote, whether in craft or art making. He emphasizes that, quote, technology is not anthropologically universal. It is enabled and constrained by particular cosmologies, which go beyond mere functionality or utility. There is no one single technology, but rather multiple cosmotechnics, end quote. From this perspective, I understand the Shrutiphone not as an instrument of use, but as a technological being attuning ontogenesis and cosmogenesis. The refrain of phrase 2 is also marked by a deep immersion in the psychospiritual practice of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. The paths of bhakti, jnana, and karma yoga resonated with the metaphysical demands of raga music, while emphasizing the cultivation of an integrative center, what Sri Aurobindo calls the psychic being, the evolving soul. From this center, I began to approach raga music not as performance or artistic expression, but as a sono ritual, a sacred techniques aligning psycho-spiritual interiority with cosmic rhythms. These rituals were not aesthetic offerings for elite raga connoisseurs, but vectors in collective transformation, and also trans-individual events composing a collective field of psychocosmological becoming. The integrative impulse in this refrain emerged through a deepening relationship with the psychic being, defined by spiritual aspiration rather than any kind of a fixed identity. This center enabled me to hold the raga and jazz musician within me without collapsing one into the other, a problem I had previously experienced for years. Through integral yoga, I learned to sustain ontological tension and musical heterogeneity without seeking resolution, allowing a form of transcultural creativity to arise that moves beyond the logics of synthesis. Such creativity is not produced through mere translation or hybridity, but through the undoing of the humanist subject and the emergence of new centers of post-human individuation. From the psychic being, I no longer mediated between jazz and raga as separate systems. Instead, I engaged their collision directly, composing interference patterns that surpass the boundaries of orthodox cultural legibility. So cross-culturalism assumes contact between two distinct bodies, whereas the transcultural allows traditions to engage without privilege, overtly or covertly, one tradition over another, in the words of Stalling. This adds a new zone, D in this diagram, to the model, the emergence of the new from cultural interaction. Again, this was not synthesis, but emergence. Creativity emerged not from cultural recognition, but from ontological interference, zones of incommensurability that produce new solutions to the problematic of a transcultural zone of co-individuation. So now we're going to listen to Rag Purvi played on the Shrutiphone, which is the culmination of this phase. And it marks a kind of transcultural creativity through a co-transformation of the saxophone, of myself, the raga, without losing its traditional grounding. Okay, this takes us to phase 3, revolutionary spirituality and the emergence of post-human creativity. Sri Aurobindo was not only a mystic, yogi, poet, and philosopher, as he's commonly known, but also an anti-colonial freedom fighter and cultural revolutionary who, as Banerjee notes, taught and practiced yoga as a part of a discourse of anti-colonial resistance, liberation, creativity, and wholeness. Yoga in this context is not a tool of escape, but a technology of revolutionary spirituality. This led me to understand integral yoga as an experimental ethics of transformation, not aimed at transcending life, but at divinizing it. Its horizon is not individual salvation, but collective becoming, grounded in spiritual realization and a shared aspiration of plural oneness. Sri Aurobindo calls this a Gnostic society. As his spiritual collaborator, the Mother, writes, quote, a Gnostic community can only exist through the inner realization of each member, each one realizing his unity with all others as much as with his own body, not mentally or artificially, but as a fact of consciousness, end quote. This is the foundation of what she calls spiritual anarchy, and what Banerjee describes as self-governing, anarchistic communities of open spiritual fraternity. Oroville, founded in 1968, was conceived by the Mother as a, quote, a site of material and spiritual research for a living embodiment of an actual human unity, end quote. Yet this utopian aspiration has faced tensions along the way. cultural orthodoxy, neoliberal co-optation by the New Age industry, and nationalistic interference. These conditions revealed that no place is immune to political or ideological or economic capture. This deepened my commitment to exploring how integral yoga might activate revolutionary potentials, not only in ashrams or intentional communities, but through micro-political and aesthetic conditions that make spiritual anarchy possible. During a trip to Oroville, I experienced a ruptural event that reoriented my trajectory and activated a new reframe, what I call post-human creativity. This experience revealed a relation between two previously quite separate axes of my spiritual and aesthetic praxis. A vertical axis of self-transcendence, what I call becoming universal, and a horizontal or transversal axis, what I call becoming other. I came to understand that integral yoga demands the integration of both planes. Banerjee articulates this beautifully as a, quote, will to universality and oneness through deep relationality and intense intimacy, end quote. The mother echoes this when she says, when you are conscious of the whole world at the same time, then you can become conscious of the divine, end quote. This movement from individual multiplicity to transpersonal universality initiates a form of creative consciousness I would understand as properly post-human. I experienced these as two distinct modes of genesis, the vertical and the transversal, which I just discussed, in which I became an operator, folding inward and outward while simultaneously being folded inside and outside through the sono ritual. This process dissolved boundaries between human and non-human, mind, body, self, other, while ushering in liminal subjectivities. It opened me not only to new aesthetic intensities, but also to the realization that post-human creativity carries profound ethical and political implications. In these experiences, and the aleatory point emerged as a ruptural moment of attunement between the two axes, a site of possible reciprocal determination between ontogenesis and cosmogenesis, where individual becoming cosmos and cosmos becoming individual unfolds as a single transductive moment. The refrain of this phase responds to that experience by initiating a search for new creative approaches to aesthetic praxis. Through my studies with Debussy, I turned to Deleuze and Guattari, whose chapter of the refrain in 1,000 Plateaus activated new transductive potentials within my transcultural mandala of becoming, illuminating cosmic and a future-oriented vision of aesthetic praxis. They write, quote, for there is no imagination outside of technique. The modern figure is not the child or the lunatic, still less the artist, but the cosmic artisan. A homemade atomic bomb is very simple, really. It's been proven, it's been done, end quote. The cosmic artisan is not a genius creator, but an operator who connects a material with forces of consistency or consolidation, forging ruptural conjunctions and disjunctions between technique and becoming cosmic. Quote, the invocation to the cosmos does not at all operate as a metaphor. The operation is an affective one, end quote. Through this, one leaves the milieus and the earth behind, inventing not representations of the world, but new planes of consistency through creative material collisions. Unlike modernist notions of the artist genius or capitalist image of the cultural producer, the post-human artist, in my opinion, is an operator, a facilitator of transduction between materials, forces, and unknown potentials, to compose consistency between heterogeneous forces, to invoke the cosmos not as a metaphor, but as an event. The cosmic artisan plugs into sound, ritual, and intuition to generate new foldings of the inside and the outside. In my practice, to become an operator, I open to the aleatory point as a method, as also as a metaphysical and experiential anchor, a, a mystical threshold of becoming music, a process of individuation without identity, best expressed by Deleuze-Guattari as, quote, experimentation on oneself is our only identity, end quote. So the composition you'll hear now is called Nature Boy by Eden Abez, which I recorded in Oroville on both Esraj and soprano, set to a 100-stringed instrument called the sound bed, an instrument created by Aurelio at Swadam in Oroville. I don't consider this a performance, but it was me opening to a post-human creativity through ritual of attunement, a listening with the world through becoming other. Okay, bringing us to phase 4, aphrological improvisation and the emergence of heterocultural creativity. This phase in my apprenticeship marks my return to the West to attend CIS, to pursue grad school and discover new relationships between integral theory and artistic praxis. This phase was musically catalyzed by encounters with the aphrological tradition of free jazz and experimental free improvisation. These improvisatory practices also expose the limits of transcultural aesthetics, ethics, and politics. To make sense of this, I turn to George Lewis's distinction between aphrological and urological music. The aphrological, grounded in African American cultural experience, embraces agency, social necessity, personality, and difference, maintaining strong ties to popular and folk traditions. It is defined by a heterogeneous sound ideal that resists standardization and entwines personal narrative with social context. As Lewis writes, quote, the sound of the improvisation seems to tell us what kind of person is improvising. We feel that we can hear character or personality in the way the musician improvises, end quote. Crucially, aphrological improvisation affirms spirituality as immanent force within aesthetic practice, especially in the work of John Coltrane, Alice Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders, William Parker, and David S. Ware, people I have engaged with in this dissertation. In contrast, the urological lineage, epitomized by John Cage, pursues depersonalized indeterminacy. Cage's dictum to let sounds be themselves enacts a conceptual distanciation, removing sound from embodied histories, spiritual desire, and political urgency. Lewis critiques this as a form of whiteness as power through transcendental disavowal that depoliticizes the sonic. I experienced two formative ruptural events in this phase. One while listening to Roscoe Mitchell live in San Francisco, and another during a free improvisation session in Oakland. These encounters catalyze the refrain of this phase, which responds critically to the Cagean mode of detached indeterminacy. In its place, I develop the notion of aleatory improvisation, a practice of attuning to sonic rupture through pluralism grounded in care, presence, deep listening, and affirmation in sonic difference. My aesthetic praxis turned towards finding experimental fields of heterogenesis, the generation of difference through difference. My earlier orientation towards transcultural creativity still subtly was rooted in ideals of harmony or synthesis, and which was destabilized by these sonic ruptural events that resisted resolution. The aleatory improvisational field does not reconcile asymmetries, it activates them. Difference became not a problem to solve, but a vector of creative and ontological risk. This refrain was inspired by the revolutionary free jazz musician William Parker and his concept of universal tonality, which resonates deeply with my notion of heterocultural creativity. Parker writes, "Universal tonality is another name for love," speaking to the essential role of aspiration and affect in guiding ethical cultural collisions. Aesthetic intuition emerged as operator in this field, a transductive faculty attuned to differential intensities and their aleatory points. In these sonic events, I did not perform a self. I felt like I underwent heterogenesis, the becoming music of a subject who no longer coincided with themselves. So this leads to the final level of Stalling's framework, the heterocultural. Unlike cross, inter, or transcultural, the term heterocultural avoids positing discrete autonomous cultures between which exchanges occur, or a transcendent vantage point beyond culture itself. Instead, it complicates the very notion of culture as a stable or singular formation. In this frame, creativity is not a mediation between two fixed or even hazy identities, but the event of their becoming other through contact, rupture, and resonance. I came to see that culture are already heterogeneous, plural from within. So why insist on smoothing their edges into my own image of harmony? Why not let difference sound spontaneously, unresolved, dissonant, and alive? Heterocultural creativity thus emerges as a spiritual, political, and aesthetic orientation towards life as experiment. Rather than fusing separate traditions, it proliferates unpredictable resonances through ethical vulnerability and shared presence. It affirms that the deepest ethical and ontological work of improvisation lies in affirming one's voice through developing the capacity to participate in plural oneness. In this sense, heterocultural musicality is not a genre or fusion. It is a politics of listening, an ethics of improvisation that affirms the possibility of a planetary collectivity through aspirational and intuitive resonance, not representation. It creates not works, but conditions for rupture, for relation, for becoming other. This problematic was explored in the transdisciplinary project Anima, created alongside Debashish, who offers poetry, and Jyoti Nauki Erai, who contributes artwork. Structured through an improvisational posture, poetic diagrams, and graphic scores, Anima enacted a speculative assemblage of sonic, visual, and conceptual forces. It rejected artistic autonomy in favor of co-creation, functioning as a diagrammatic event, a generative refrain of aleatory improvisation and heterocultural creativity, in my opinion.
Vayu spawned a new phylum of technical objects, wind instruments, particularly trumpet and saxophone, miles and train, to stereotype the field for lack of breath. Though not a water or grain holder, this, as wind controller, gave the receptive function of the receptacle, being open, embraced, made love to, and let go its spiritus, the urban shaman celebration of jazz. Its brother celebrated the ghetto's despair in knife and black laughter. Translating bebop vitalism to an electric medium, in an ocean of chaos, he baptized with Dionysus and birthed the blues. Electric guitar, alone able to cry like the stars in the night sky, as well as with the anguish of hell, open gutter of unfathomable unconscious, in the hands of Buddy Guy, Hendrix, Clapton, Jimmy Page, Duane Allman, Santana, or the incomparable John McLaughlin, release the birds of fire.
Okay, we reach our conclusion. I'll stay here. As this research moves towards its conclusion, I offer a diagram which situates the problematic I discovered based on these autoethnographic results. A mandala of transindividuation. This mandala triangulates three existential and political positions. The I, so on the left side here, in the individuating self, embedded and becoming. The we, a collective field in motion. And the they, the forces of capture, the culture industries, the systems of normalization, or regimes of subjectification. At this level, it becomes a critical topology of cultural memory, asking what inherited forces shape our perceptual and ethical limits? How might we reanimate the latent potentials of minor genealogies, of countercultural, revolutionary, and spiritual sonocultures buried beneath dominant narratives? Not through imitation, but through improvisational transformation. The second layer, the present, integrates the political, ethical, and aesthetic dimensions that this research revealed as inseparable. The political corresponds to the they, critiquing structural constraints while inventing new conditions for becoming. The ethical maps onto the we, affirming shared aspirations and collective values. The aesthetic resonates with the I, not as ego, but as operator within a cosmotechnic ritual, an artist navigating a trans-individual field through aesthetic intuition. The mandala is not a representation of selfhood, but a zone of transduction, a living diagram that assembles these forces into dynamic consistency. In relation to this research, its function is fourfold: to short circuit the overcoding of the culture industries, to co-activate revolutionary sonic lineages, to form a we grounded in trans-individual aspiration, and to hold a speculative vanishing point from which a trans-individual sound body might emerge. This is the work of the mandala of transindividuation, not to describe the self, but to compose a field of self, other, and world co-creation. It affirms that our becoming is never ours alone. The aleatory point, the integrative impulse, and the dark precursor are not signs of escape, but of return, a return to the real work, to co-compose a world worthy of our deepest aspirations. This research invites you, not only as audience, but as co-experimenters, to contemplate what makes up your own mandala of becoming, to ask how might each node in your life become not just a site of personal growth, but a threshold of collective transformation. Each node marks a rupture and a relation where the individual meets the social, the cosmic, and the historical. So if the mandala of transindividuation is a speculative diagram of becoming, sonofictioning is its performance, its enactment through improvisational encounter, aesthetic risk, and the collective stakes of world making. Sonofictioning names a future-oriented aesthetic method grounded in what Deleuze calls fabulation, not the invention of fantasy worlds, but of a people yet to come. Quote, art must take part in this task, not that of addressing a people, which is supposedly already there, but of contributing to the invention of a people, end quote. To fabulate is to resist repeating regimes of representation. It is to create a sonic fiction that does not reflect the world but conditions its emergence, its unforeseeable post-human becoming. In this light, sonofictioning becomes a mode of transindividuation, activating shared aesthetic intuitions to build a world where difference is not resolved but held, sounded, and amplified in the name of a collective, unfinished liberation. As a practice, I explored this through an original composition, which marks the conclusion of this research, titled For a People to Come, which draws directly on the framework of the East-West Psychology Department, my home here. East, West, Earth, World, as affective and cultural orientations. There is no score in the traditional sense. The diagram becomes the site of encounter, a sound space where aleatory points may emerge, rupturing habitual relations and opening the field of collective becoming. For a people to come enacts the mandala of transindividuation in a certain way. It materializes the research central insight that new collectivities do not arise through consensus, but through intuitive attunement and experimental becoming in and across difference. What emerges is not just a piece of music, but a plane of composition, one that activates the unknown, transduces it through sound, and holds space for a collective aspiration that cannot be represented, only lived. This is the task of the sonic arts in our times, not to reflect a world, but to compose the conditions for one, to activate the integrative impulse as a shared refrain. To co-compose a new people and earth requires not only vision, but an attunement to the aleatory, those singularities that cannot be planned, but must be invited through ritual, intuition, and experimentation. Every true aesthetic encounter, there is a chance that such a point will arise. When it arrives, will you surrender into the unforeseeable music that composes you, that composes us as a trans-individuating sound body? And here's the last page of the score, which is a diagram that we played from. And then here's so Bea, Andrew, and Kayla and I performed this. It's an hour-long piece of music, and I'll play you 1 minute of it because I'm at 1 hour and 1 minute right now. So if that's okay, I'll just take another extra minute.
Sure.
I'll just jump to one more, please. Okay. I'll end it there. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. I think we'll now proceed to the question answer session, part of our defense. And I'll invite first Stephen to start us off with our discussion on this.
All right. Okay, so thanks, Jonathan, for your presentation today. And it was great to see some of the images and hear some of the sounds that have made up the other side of the PhD, in addition to the written material that I've been working with you on. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the privilege and the pleasure of supervising your PhD. Not only because of your energy and enthusiasm in your research, which made the process a pleasure, but also because of the richness of your material and method, from which I learned a great deal. I had never even really heard of an autoethnography, let alone supervised a PhD in it. So I certainly, that was a real learning experience for me, and a very interesting and profitable one. My first question is, maybe I'm abusing my position here as being the first one to ask a question, but my first question has got about 3 questions in it, but they're all kind of more or less aimed at the same thing. So I guess you can take the long way or the short way to answer it. Anyway, I leave that up to you. So early in chapter 2, while discussing the term cosmogenesis, you write, this dissertation is concerned with the philosophical use that is post-materialist and includes the idea of consciousness. That's the end of the quote from chapter 2. Now, I want to ask actually 3 questions about this. You draw some crucial terms, you've rehearsed some of them in your presentation today, from Deleuze's book, Difference and Repetition, and in particular, you rest a lot upon the terms of dark precursor, problematic idea, which later in the thesis kind of morphs into problematic field, and the virtual and the actual. And these terms are all important for Deleuze's attack on the Kantian schematism and the rationalist and representational image of thought that emerges from it. In place of this, Deleuze suggests a superior empiricism, as he calls it, which privileges affect and real experience over the concept and the conditions of possible experience it imposes. I would like to ask you to explain more precisely how the terms you take from difference and repetition contribute to a post-materialist philosophy, and what the role of consciousness might be in this. Related to this, you use vocabulary from difference and repetition, especially problematic idea and the virtual, that has been called idealist by some commentators, most notably by Badiou and Rancière. These terms more or less evaporate in Deleuze's later work with Guattari, which uses a much more materialist vocabulary focusing on planes, territories, and movements. Given that you also draw a lot from Deleuze and Guattari's work, I would like to know how these terms, or how this term of consciousness tracks across Deleuze's work alone and with Guattari. So in other words, does the work with Deleuze and Guattari, does that change, how you understand consciousness as working within, the broader aim of cosmogenesis?
Mm-hmm.
Finally, you draw on Deleuze's work on Spinoza, and in particular the beatitudes specific to the third kind of knowledge in the ethics, and you use this to connect the concept of atheistic mysticism to the cosmogenesis of your sono-ritual. My question is how Spinoza's system of mind-body parallelism connects to your understanding of post-materialist philosophy and the operation of consciousness, if it does in fact connect to them, I guess. Yeah, so there's kind of three questions there, I guess, but they're all sort of focused about how you articulate the mind and body within the overall schema of your project, and how consciousness operates within this relation. And if I just can squeeze in a last question, my last question would then be where the spiritual, which becomes a very important term later on in the thesis, where the spiritual fits into the mind-body relation and consciousness in relationship to your project. So yeah, sorry. I mean, you can choose to answer that how you like, but.
Okay, cheers. Yes, there's a lot here to address. I've made a little diagram that will hopefully get me to creatively work through these definitely some of the biggest kind of horizons of what is coming together in this work. And I think that you rightly are bringing out some of the challenges and also the possible the problematic, I guess you could say, the problematic of transcultural and heterocultural method or thinking. I've focused through aesthetic praxis through my own experience of that. But I think that, going deeper into how I am engaging with these concepts is really important. And like I had said at the beginning, that each one formed a different type of a lens, which was really aimed at kinds of a practical orientation. And so that's what became the driving kind of force behind how I was engaging with different ideas, different thinkers that can't be or aren't really necessarily able to be reduced to a cross-cultural framework of comparison, because they're coming from quite different problematic situations. And so that's, I guess, a little bit of a preamble to all of these questions, because you are getting at the kind of the core of how these things are can't be synthesized into one thing.
But just to say, Jonathan, I'm not asking you any questions about the Indian material because I'm not qualified to ask you a question about that. I'm really asking you about the
Specifically, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Deleuze-Guattari stuff.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess I was responding to the idea of the term consciousness and the spiritual, which is definitely coming from the Eastern side. But right, how does that relate to the Western side? And I guess that this term post-materialist is really a way of not, again, it's not a in the same way that posthumanism isn't a negation of the human, it's a critical engagement with it in a way that is engaging with what that construct is and what it has done and how it remains within us and in history. And I think that when I use the term post-materialist, it's aiming at the kind of materialistic reduction that has happened a lot, that has come out of I guess you could say in our times, in post Enlightenment modernity, where we have certain things that have been privileged so quite strongly, like the mind over the body, like the science over the arts, like rationality over intuition, for instance. So there's a lot of these types of binaries that I will bring out in my work, and I think that part of the invitation of Sri Aurobindo in his work has been to use these kinds of binaries and also to see them as a strategic way in which you can work to another type of a plane, which isn't limited to them, which is where we get our theory, our cultural frameworks as well. And so I think that when I would invoke something like a post-materialist framework, It's to really open the fact that we can't really, the work isn't based on accepting the conclusions of a materialism versus an idealism as two distinct and separate things. And this is where I think, again, to bring in how all of these thinkers from East and West, they're kind of opening to in different ways, but they have similar questions that are asking me as a reader, and I think that would be one of them. Especially when it comes down to, the idea of like an analytical argument for one or the other, when the idea of experience is much beyond like the the qualitative analysis of something, but a quantitative lived experience. And so I think in that way, it opens to certain kinds of expressions of beyond a dualistic approach, which is again properly in a post-humanist framework, I think. So again, in a broad sense, that's how I think that I would see the post-materialist. In terms of the term that you related it to, cosmogenesis, for instance, I mean, if we look at the diagram and the aleatory point that would enter into attunement, this ontogenetic kind of interior mode of individuation with a kind of the exterior, the cosmos coming within. Then again, as you get into the middle of that, I think is about complicating the ideas that we have that to properly hold the fact that it is integrally both at the same time, and that any kind of a framework which would rest on, let's say, a materialistic view of the cosmos versus a psychological, view of ontogenesis is not what this work has been necessarily. It's been about pushing through those. Okay, so let's see here. So in terms of the Deleuze concepts that I ended up working with, I think I will address the end of your first and second question together. I think that each work of Deleuze by himself, and then Deleuze and Guattari together, but each work, it kind of offered something a little different. There's something that he's getting at. He's changing his language throughout the course of his career, which you rightly point out, and that's very important and necessary to address for sure. And the shift from when he was writing by himself, like you say, he's dealing more with addressing and being in relation to the Kantian schema. When he comes into relation with Guattari, some of his motivations are in flux, in changing, and how he starts using language with Guattari changes as well. And I think that is also part of my autoethnography. It's a progress. It's there's not progress. It's what am I trying to say? There's a process in which different languages and different I guess like I had said, metaphysical structures or psychological structures can help effectuate certain types of practical transformation. And I think that in the beginning of my apprenticeship, I was working more with Deleuze's work. And I think that the book Proust and Signs really was the first book to open me up to some of the ideas that he definitely is deeply developing in difference and repetition. But like his kind of shift to meeting Guattari and engaging, leaving behind some of those idealistic tendencies, trying to find different expressions for a kind of a political project, a little bit more politically oriented, and trying to find languages that can help describe immanence in new ways. And I think that as I progress or how this, I should say, the autoethnography unfolds, is that's also part of my journey. Is, for instance, in India, in Sri Aurobindo's work, I studied and practiced, like I'd said, rag sadhana, alongside integral yoga. And it was a lot of the idealistic structures and in his writings, I would say spiritual in the sense that were much more about my own interior constitution and makeup, and really we're activating this kind of more vertical, for instance, and looking more deeply into myself and my own structures of and how they can transform. As I go through the autoethnography progresses, it becomes more also, which mirrors, although at the time I wasn't reading Deleuze and Guattari, but it does mirror that turn to understand and be more vertical, more collective on the social and political level. And that also marks a shift of what kind of concepts can help me do that. And so I guess that I would address it in that way, is that the problematic is shifting. The concepts, the ideas, the languages that activate the kinds of goals that I have is also shifting. And so in the dissertation, I do my best to clarify that as well, and to again mark that there is a difference between Deleuze and Guattari. There's a difference in language. There's a difference in the ways in which they develop their concepts and how they might be seen to be possibly activated in the world. And I just think that it has to do with attuning to what is it that your problematic is opening to, and what kind of things you need. Okay, I've dwelt on that enough, I think. In terms of this idea, so you're bringing in things I didn't necessarily get to in this presentation because of timing, but in the ending of the dissertation, I do dwell a lot on Spinoza, coming through Deleuze's reading. And I think that it's a very interesting place to now, like you kind of asked the last question, which maybe I'll fold these together, is, what is the spiritual in all of this? What do I mean by that? And how does it relate to these Western sources that I'm using? And okay, and then also I guess you asked also about, okay, where does the body-mind parallelism, and so how is it that as I get deeper into the dissertation, the theoretical, it becomes more theoretical too, and this terrain, how am I navigating these ideas? And I think that they help in a way to bring out a kind of, in the way that I've tried to describe it, a post-materialism, in the sense that okay, in the sense that I think that Spinoza's ideas have definitely oriented me more towards understanding the affect and power in terms of my life, how to increase my own capacity to act, and as well as others, and the way in which the transindividual can be thought back into even a Spinozan frame, which you can't do directly through Deleuze because he doesn't talk about the transindividual. But I think that that's why Spinoza is coming back here in my work. I think that there is an intuitive or a mystical, like you said, an atheistic mysticism in Deleuze's words that you've dealt with in one of your books, that is important in this. I think that it brings us to almost like an inspired brink of not knowing or defining what the spiritual is, but knowing that you are confronting something that is kind of like a future attractor in that sense. It's pulling you towards, okay, maybe I don't necessarily understand this rationally, but how can I maybe see these things in my life, and how can they influence how I act in the world? And that's where I think that the notion of the spiritual as being that, not as something that is transcendent. Obviously, we're dealing with Spinoza in this case, in the Western side, but something that is immanent, something that is, that's in every singularity present, is all present. But something that also we need to attune, we need to define new senses. So bringing up the third kind of knowledge, In my dissertation, I haven't thought that exactly alongside aesthetic intuition, but that would be definitely some inquiry that I should be doing into developing this. But in the same way, this is an invitation. Like, what is the third kind of knowledge? How does it work? How can I rationally understand it? Is a step there. But how can the body also participate in this and know this too? So I think this is where my understanding of the spiritual would be. The emphasis is really on how is it that we are opening to a collective future, which is where the trans individual is a body, I think, that can harbor this notion of the spiritual that is kind of I'm not really sure how to address the Spinoza mind-body parallelism specifically, to be honest, in this moment. But I think that the way that I've used aesthetic praxis is complicating exactly this, the mind and the body. It's saying that we've kind of privileged mind, of course, we've become mind-centric. Artistic practice can bring us into a body, but it doesn't negate the mind. It problematizes, it creates kind of a transductive relationship in which something new can emerge, like a third kind of knowledge, like aesthetic intuition. And so that's where I would see this research as really not really coming down on saying, well, this is the mind, this is the body, and defining those in absolute terms, but really trying to take us to a place where they can, I think, invite a transductive relationship between them. That's what I would say. Stephen, anything that you'd like to follow up with? I tried.
Please let someone else ask a question.
I think we can also spend a little more time opening it up among ourselves, just as a discussion, maybe. And I think it's a really, really important question, what you asked, Stephen, because I think also your question had to do with how does the word consciousness track through these different phases, as well as different understandings and differences. And I think particularly in department, I think it's a disciplinary question also, because in different disciplines they use a lot of these terms differently. So consciousness, for example, is related in certain disciplines to the mind, to understanding cognitively, while consciousness in certain, like in transpersonal psychology, consciousness could be related to the mind-body problem of Spinoza. In other words, it could be that which is in body as well as in mind, that which is parallel, so to say. So that there's a body consciousness, there's a mind consciousness, etc. There's ways animism uses sort of consciousness in those ways in certain disciplines, or rather certain disciplines look at animism using consciousness in those ways. Yeah, I think I think to be clear about these usages is one of the aspects of the confusion that may come for a reader who looks at these terms. Jack, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I was thinking that Spinoza says, Deleuze says about Spinoza that the what can a body do question shifts the focus not to devalue the mind, but to devalue presence to consciousness and open a kind of understanding and thinking that occurs within the body. So it's kind of like Merleau-Pontian in a way, shift to that. So, I mean, I think there is an equivocal aspect of consciousness for your problematic, where on the one hand, consciousness helps us fight against bad materialism that reduces things and says there's no consciousness. But on the other hand, consciousness is a problem insofar as it becomes idealistic and also has that counter tendency. So that would be my thoughts. And I think that you understand that, but maybe it could be clearer moving through the text where you are at in different passages, like which perspective you're taking on it.
Mm-hmm.
Also this notion of, I mean, I think what you brought up, Stephen, about the early Deleuze and then Deleuze and Guattari, and the shift from what some people see as idealist to materialist language. And I think when we use terms like post-materialist, today there's a tendency to use the term new materialism or new materialisms, where basically they want to throw out this hard distinction between the spiritual and the material, or the mental and the material, and say that either a Spinozan model or where there's parallelism or some such model where there is a complex monism. Simondon is using a model like that. It's not necessarily Spinozan, but he is talking about differences of individuation at the physical level, at the psychic level, at the collective level. And at the same time, it's the same processes that are kind of going on in these levels, zones. So it is a kind of you could say, a new materialism understanding, but at the same time, it's not an ontological problem, it's an epistemological problem. You're centering yourself at a different zone of knowledge. So I would say one could argue that the early Deleuze and the later Deleuze and Guattari are taking kind of different centers of cognition, rather than a kind of a radical difference in ontology. But I think, I think one of the things that probably needs to be clarified is this distinction, be more clear about it, about the fact that something is going on and there is a difference that needs to be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stephen, do you have anything to respond to that?
I mean, we could kind of get into it, but I don't want to be a roadblock to the whole process. So maybe it's better to see if we have time left to come back and let other people ask some questions.
Yeah, I think, Jack, why don't you go with some other questions that you may have?
Yeah, I have, like Stephen, a lot of questions that hopefully I can lump together into one question. And yeah, I want to ask a question maybe more on the side of the moral and the moral overlapping with the metaphysical, and specifically like pointing it on the question of evil and valuation and the question of transvaluation. And I don't know, there are moments where you seem to go from one perspective to the other, where we have a kind of Nietzschean, Spinozist, Deleuzian, complete transvaluation of all values sort of move. And then on the other hand, the sort of more Bergsonian, Sri Aurobindo, Coltrane, maybe the Afrological, which is more rooted in certain values that aren't being completely uprooted or changed. And they're a spectrum of interpretations of Spinoza and Deleuze and Nietzsche on the question of transvaluation. But if we get rid of all of the organs, we no longer have any bodies capable of doing anything. So the body without organs, while it's an ideal, can be a dangerous goal if we actually get rid of all of our organs, right? If we try to transvaluate all of our values, we'll lose the value of transvaluation itself. So I think that transvaluation is always kind of contextual and within a certain framing. And so you'll say stuff like harmony, like you'll talk both ways about harmony being something good and something bad. Like we need to get away from this things are in tune and things are out of tune. but it kind of waffles sometimes on relativism that I don't think is actually consistent with a Bergsonian and maybe not even a Spinozist and Deleuzian perspective. I mean, we see Deleuze attempting an ethical moral project, and this is not an easy thing to draw out of Deleuze philosophy. Like, it's something that scholars are working on right now. Like, what kind of ethics can we really pull out of Deleuze? And Deleuze has been used dangerously, you know, and so has Nietzsche, right? And of course, we even find Bergson's open and closed morality was like used in fascist Italy in the 30s. So it's not impossible to kind of dilute anything. It is, right? But at the same time, I do think that there's more of this tendency within Deleuze thinking to be able to be co-opted in different directions. I mean, I think that there is a serious attempt to break down the fascistic tendency at the micrological level, epistemologically, but also you might say like personally and phenomenologically, right? So I do think that's there. I'm not trying to say it's not there, but I think that it gets slippery, and the question of value and what I think is kind of like a uh, equivocity of values. Like, I think that there's a problem with leveling all values or saying that like all values can equally be transvaluated, the transvaluation of all values, right? I mean, even if we think like the most common sort of centers of value are things like utility, beauty, truth, love, play, expression, right? You can't do all of these at once. And if you try to, you're going to mess them up, right? Sometimes things are useful, but they're not beautiful. Other things are beautiful and have no use, right? And the fact that life includes an equivocity or a plurality of values that cannot be satisfied simultaneously, right? I think that that is like a key to the pluralistic approach that you're describing. And I think Sri Aurobindo and Bergson give us a ton to think about that, and Merleau-Ponty and others. Deleuze, I think, does as well, but he also gives us a lot to kind of not really be able to understand it clearly and coherently. So I feel like that tension between the Deleuzian and the Aurobindo Bergsonian aphrological, even sort of a continuity, and then questions of like personality, I feel like you kind of go back and forth on too. Like, sometimes we want an impersonal and sometimes we want a personal, right? And I think that like for Bergson, the personal, there's a good sense of the personal, which is like a virtuality that includes contradictions, right? Like, it's the whole of our pure memory and our potentiality and things like that. And it's unindividuated in a sense, you could say, right? Our personal complexity becomes individuated in different ways, right? And we can also be individuating pre-personally, right? That's like a pure perception. When I'm coinciding with the becoming of the sensible world, I'm depersonalizing in some sense, or I'm at a pre-personal level, but it's individuating because it's the event singularity in that moment, right? So there's this tension between the individual and the personal for Bergson, and I think also like Sri Aurobindo and this aphrological way of thinking that kind of oftentimes becomes I don't want to say victimized, but like attacked in some way in a more I don't know if it's a adolescent Deleuzianism or a superficial Deleuzian idea. The same thing we can get in like a kind of undergraduate reading of Nietzsche and things like that. So anyway, I'm going all over the place, but the question of good and evil, I think, comes back. And I think that when, for example, Spinoza wants to say, get rid of good and evil, but we still have power and like what works and what doesn't work. And we still like are building affects that, you know, find compossibility, things that work together. So that's a question of harmony. It's a question of making things work. Really, we've returned back to, you know, striving for beatitude and goodness, right? Even if we don't call it goodness.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, anyway, that's a whole mess of questions, but um,
Yeah, beautiful. No, I think that again, why autoethnography works in this case for me is because I feel like I lived through the tensions of these questions. Because when I arrived at India and started deepening into the roots of living there, and like I expressed in that phase, I really felt I felt that there's a difference between a paradoxical space and a poetic space, I felt, which was like there's a dead end here. And that's a lot of the times where people are just going to turn around and leave. It's like, well, I can't understand why people value life the way they do, why they live the way they do. Like, how is it that this works? And I think that this journey, and I think you're right. The term that I use that I'm definitely again part of developing this idea of the trans individual is to develop a rigorous pluralism here. And I think that, like a lot of things, the closer you get to something, the more that you come back to the top of the circle from where you may have started, or that you get back to close to where its opposite lies. Um, so I think that I am threading a fine needle, and again, as a strategic way of writing, there are times, and I do try to address this in the dissertation, but this was also part of my journey. It was like this kind of opening to the transcendent, to like the deterritorialization into the spiritual, for instance, which really marked more of a orthodox reading of Indian spiritual traditions, which you escape or you get out. And again, that kind of turned back with through the help of Devashish and reading Sri Aurobindo as a form of revolutionary spirituality, put me right back into the problems of how is it that we can actually, find not spirit and matter as two separate things. One will solve these problems, one will solve these other problems or whatnot, but sit and integrally hold them not as opposites, but as like on a spectrum. And so, in terms of ethics, he in the Life Divine does get into, Sri Aurobindo talks about supra ethics, and I think that really relates to what Debashish was talking about earlier. There's different planes and there's different perspectives that you can have within a plural oneness in a way. And I think that that's where, this idea of strategy is important. But really, I think it's not, this is again where it's like my strategy or my idea of what is right in this moment. This is what I confronted in India. It's like, well, that may be good for me, but what about other people? That there are these zones of incommensurability. There's these ontological interference patterns. And it was about me kind of taking a step back and yes, having to transvalue myself. This kind of happened. I guess I would bring up the notion of the psychic being as being an integrative center, which is of one of the perspectives, but it also knows many different other perspectives. The physical consciousness, the intellectual consciousness, the intuitive consciousness. So I think that that's where you get maybe these zones of interference patterns rather than one looking at the other and defining the other and putting the other into where it needs to put it. So to be very clear, the mind was my biggest issue. Um, so what happens then when you get into a place where the mind isn't going to be generating an ethical code or moral code, or doesn't have a rigid structure of values? Then it becomes about opening to the space. And so the end of my dissertation, why is it that I'm compelled towards the trans individual, and the hetero, or sorry, trans cultural and the heterocultural, is because I feel that those spaces offered me like they offered me more capacity to really to put myself into question and to co-transform this idea of really inhabiting a space of emergence in which values, definitely, I'm not saying you don't like get rid of all your values, but you put them into question to say that at any moment a value can actually radically shift according to what's disclosed. And so this can be happening in any kind of a cross or transcultural, heterocultural space. But I really see that as being the ethics of improvisation. And improvisation is pretty clear in many cases, anyway, in my experience, when you have people that are really truly in plural oneness, who are really truly able to honor the tension that, like, the kind of potential of dissonance, unsounded dissonance, if you will, and work with that and kind of and there's a sense in which there is a co-individuation. There's not just separate individuations going on. And I think that that is really what I'm trying to get to in terms of the emergent kind of the emergent of values as being something that's really important in developing any kind of a framework of pluralism. And I guess what else? There was one other thing. Anyway, I guess I could also address, yes, in terms of, again, in terms of language, it's a challenging one. I could be specific here in terms of how, like I said to answering Stephen's question, how there was this kind of initially a flight into more transcendence, leaving the world behind. But as I turned back, so there's like a de-identification. When you depersonalize, you de-identify with yourself, you become other. But then that also becomes a form of spiritual bypassing. So when you come back, what's left of this, or what is the self in that way? And I think that the difference would be, I mentioned, there's experiences or ways in which there's individuation without identity. And yet what the aphrological brings back is the social, like the political kind of necessity of personality, of personhood. It's not a disillusionment of person into, but it's really like, how does your individual, in like your personhood, your individuation, how does that get stronger within the collective group? But it's to be more precise, what it's through collective experience. This is my what I've taken and what I have practiced musically, for instance. But it's through really that surrendering, putting yourself into question, that your actual personhood, the sound of you, is actually amplified without having it necessarily having to be an identity. So I think that's where the difference between identity and personhood, personality would lie in this work. I see that as, like, I see identity more as an ideological surface, and again, in the aphrological, I guess the personality, personhood would not be reducible to that. But I guess what I'll say, one more thing, because there's a big question here, but is that I encountered. Now, to be clear about the autoethnography, is that I encountered Sri Aurobindo first. There is a linearity to this as well. As well as I've said, the mandala of becoming, it doesn't seem to work in a linear fashion sometimes. It seems to resonate across series in ways that that don't depend on how things occurred in time per se. But I did encounter Sri Aurobindo first, and I think that my the attraction to that praxis is this idea of the psychic being, I think, as being, I use the word center, but again, there's still a problem. Like, how centered is it? How a center without a center? There's ways in which we can get in, like, how is it an integral thing? Like, well, how does it hold integrality, I guess you could say, difference and unity. And I think that's where I've found a root in my own aesthetic praxis and my spiritual praxis, that has been an ongoing question. I don't have it's one of those things that can only be experienced, and you can formulate words, and Sri Aurobindo has written a lot of words about it, what the psychic being may be, but it's one of those things that I see as a perpetual question, something that puts what I think of myself, my identity, into question, so as to continually to open to difference, open to transformation. And I think that's one thing that I brought with me into reading Deleuze as well. I think that the way in which Deleuze is his constructive project, in his early work, but especially Deleuze and Guattari, there's clearly a constructive project going on. Yet I don't think that it takes as clear a shape as something like the psychic being, cultivating what Trier-Bindo would call a psychic being, or even what Simondon talks about as a transindividual, which is why I've incorporated Simondon into the work. There's something that is of the articulating some kind of a constructive project, and I think that it's on that razor's edge, because as soon as you present something too clearly, then it can be captured, like I pointed out. It surfaces or whatnot. It can be, and I think that's where Deleuze and Guattari and throughout their works, there's this constant shifting. There's this constant kind of, I would say, trying to continually undermine the forces that they might be feeling as coming in and encroaching for capture. So I think that there's something about that's also important in keeping it open. Like for instance, like how to make yourself a body without organs. Yes, it's very clearly it's like a deterritorialization, but like you said, it's not. They completely warn against that. It's not complete deterritorialization. So what remains? What is it we choose to remain as opposed to choose to put into question? You know, I mean, I don't think it's really always up to us. It's up to our encounters. It's up to, the values that emerge in a moment and what we need to retain. I think we need to, or what we need to know as being, found like some kind of a ground in that moment for us to be on is important, so that we can open to these more, open to these more ethical possibilities of co-transformation. It's not just co-deterritorialization only. Everybody has to be strategic, and that I think that I find that in, especially, I mean, just to bring up William Parker, his music. If you listen to his music, there's something that is constantly on the edge of feeling like it's going to explode open, but at the same time go deeper into something that is embodied and grounded. So I'm not sure if music is just a way to for me to end with trying to articulate that. But
Let me just, if I can, just really quickly respond. If I don't know if we're out of time, but I mean, I think that there are many Deleuze's, right? Like we have to see Deleuze himself as like a pack, right? With diverging ideas and thoughts and like lines of flight that can't be converged, right? And there's something about scholarship on Deleuze trying to keep all that in tension and keep it together. And then there's like just being inspired by Deleuze and like using certain Deleuzian ideas and oblique strategies and things like that. Well, anyway, I think in that spectrum of multi-dimensional tensions, you're more on like the Leibniz side. And I've suggested a number of times like his book on Leibniz, the book Leibnizing, and just thinking through that, because I think that the coherent view of like a plurality of perspectives that takes value as not ever merely a construction is in Leibniz, it's in Bergson, it's in Trier-Bindo. And yes, like transvaluation is what we want, but like there are simple things like when you're playing music, you don't stop listening with care and love to the sounds that your co-musicians are playing. So like that value, it might look different at different moments, but like you're not giving up on that value, right? And I think that like there are certain values that we can be like, okay, look, however we describe it, we're gonna go wrong, but like we feel it and we're sticking to it, right? And I really think like this is the musical idea as such. And I've talked to you about this, but borrowing a line from Proust, the musical idea, which Deleuze also talks about and Merleau-Ponty picks up, it's this idea that we hear music and we think an idea that we can't put into words and that we can't talk about, but when we interact with music, we can think this idea. And what is this idea? Well, it's find your own voice. It's try to play something new. It's, make the old songs sound interesting somehow. It's all of these things, and it's none of them. It's also like take a small amount of musical material and make a giant tapestry out of it, right? By repeating through variation. It's all of these ideas, and it's none of them. And we can't satisfy all of them at once, but we can, in duration, shift between them and give them each their proper due. So anyway, that's we've gone too long.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Jack. I think we're actually at the end of our 2 hours, but I will ask one small question. And then I think, Jonathan, if you can keep your answer short, we can sort of. I think one of the things I was thinking, also related to all the discussions that we've had so far, the paradoxical nature of what you're talking about. Everything that can be said has got two sides to it. And the difficulty of actually sort of really holding out in a dissertation about that, because you're always going to look like you've, sort of privileged one aspect rather than the other. And that kind of a thing also goes into your methodology. For example, when we are saying autoethnography, it's like you're centering yourself. But actually, as you say right from the beginning, there's this collective dimension. When you're talking about the trans individual, or you're talking about collective transformation or a habitus, there is the notion of collective responsibility. And, I mean, so becoming a jazz musician, talking about autoethnography, talking about moments of rupture, etc., they all belong to yourself. What about the necessity or the responsibility of the habitus? Where is the world that you want to make? Uh, where does it slip out of your own hands? And where does it lie, in collective responsibility?
Wow, beautiful. Yeah. I mean, what came up for me is the way that Galope frames aesthetic praxis, and is interesting because he talks about it as the magnetic powers of affect and the structuring powers of cognition. And I think that there's like the reciprocal determination between ontogenesis and cosmogenesis, or individuation and transindividuation. I think that that's where the community, I think where the community, the habitus and the community building, where this project and the pluralism lies. But I think that's where really continuing to develop new practices of care, practices of deep listening, practices of putting oneself into question, in ways that kind of blur the distinction, in ways of not truly knowing where you end and where it starts. This interpenetration, is why things like, I think, like the aleatory. I think this is what improvisation has taught me, and why it does come with an ethics, and why we need to think of it through the aphrological, because it's always been with that. And I think that that's where, turning away from the projection of what you think something should be, or like I said, you know, kind of like taming the edges into my image of something, or my image of harmony, my image of finality. I think that really that's where putting paradox at the core of one's life, that's life as experimentation. I think that That's where you can't really produce reproducible products. You can't for a market. You really have to. I think you have to really engage in the fact that every moment carries with it the potential for a rupture, for an unknown, and that's actually part of care.
Yeah, but you're even in your answer, you're talking about yourself in terms of the
Mhm.
responsibility towards experimentation in
Okay.
oneself. But I think, you also presented, in that towards the end, you're talking about the triangle with the I, the we, and the they, right?
Hmm.
Which is actually coming to some extent from Stiegler, Stiegler's critique of
Hmm.
Heidegger to some extent. And
Hmm.
I think that necessity for the creating of a we, the necessity for a plural habitus, the responsibility towards a politics of plurality, uh, you know, in a community, not just in an
Yeah,
individual, but also in a community. I think that's an aspect that's really central to I think what you're trying to do, which I come across it in glimpses, but
absolutely.
I also think that the mode of writing autoethnographically sort of downplays that in favor of talking about the personal process.
True, true. Hmm.
I think we'll stop here, and
Okay.
I think can the audience. You should engage with the audience, and they can continue to sort of. I would have loved for us to be part of it, but I think we're running out of time. So I'll request Stefan to put the three of us into a room, a sort of breakout room, and Jonathan can continue with the audience.
It looks like
Okay.
they're in the room.
Have some hands up. Yeah, please. Yeah, you could raise your hand or jump in if there's an awkward pause. But Christo.
Yeah, what an amazing dissertation, Jonathan. What a pleasure to see you explain all your ideas in a formal, coherent, and organized fashion like that after I've been exposed to them various ways in piecemeal fashion. I also had the pleasure of seeing David Glover's dissertation, which is kind of similar to me in a sense, in that there's a personal practice that's being converted into an academic discussion. So I would love some of your ideas, like your panel was talking to. When you said experimentation, first of all, I'm sorry that the panel didn't mention the word heterogeneity, because I thought that was a key cultural heterogeneity, that term you coined to describe what you're doing. There's also, when you said experimentation, I thought also just your practice seeing the four musicians sitting together in the room together. How much is the we also a process? I also noticed you've been using the word process, the pronunciation of process instead of process. There's my friend from Edmonton has me saying process now. I've made that conversion. So, but in the what can your musical improvisation, your musical togetherness, uh, teach us about creating a we as a process of improvisation? I didn't that word improvisation was really important
Hmm.
for me.
Great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah, exactly. And I can definitely, differentiating these terms even more is helpful, and I have done it in the dissertation to the best of my ability. Um, I think that, I mean, improvisation can mean a lot of things for sure. I recall in the dissertation, my first ruptural event, which was standing up in a big band and having 16 bars allotted to me to improvise in. Um, and that's a very much, you know, charted out. It's a certain length. There's certain chord changes. There's a lot of things that you would follow in terms of how that music works, a big band music. And improvisation in that context is much more. It is actually more individualistic on the surface because you stand up and you are a featured one, and the big band accompanies you in a way. That's one way of framing that kind of improvisation. Now I take as I go forward in the autoethnography, that's where I start to learn how to improvise and engage with the jazz tradition from that era. But jazz also undergoes a lot of radical transformations, and I end up exploring free jazz, which is a part of questioning those kind of agreed upon constraints, and rupturing through them. And then even differentiate between free jazz and free improvisation, which may not have a root in the Black free jazz movement. And those musics emerge in the 60s, 70s, and I think that this is where the term experimental comes in, because it's not necessarily resting in as much of a predefined or pre-given framework. There's still obviously a context. There's still obviously a tradition. There's still obviously habits that form. And yet, at the same time, I think that I look at it as a beautiful practice of collectivity in the idea of co-engagement with a problematic space. This problematic space is underdetermined. Things may happen in it, they may not. You are free to bring what you like to the table. And it's really like the attunement of, where you are at, where you are feel into the space, where others are at, what arises is going to change your experience of the whole of that experience at each moment too. And so things shift and morph, and it's a very, I think that it's something that happens again in a very specific context generally, but how is it that we can learn from that as a model in terms of, again, putting ourselves into question in terms of what does that mean? That means engaging in individuation as a problematic, not as a predefined, I want this, I want to look like this, which I still would say is part of identity formulation. And so that's where I see this kind of space as harboring some of the terms that I used a lot over the work, like aspiration, a shared aspiration, which is not the same thing. That is a poetic almost evocation of we don't aspire for the same thing, but we are definitely sharing intentionality. And I think that that's where trying to take this model out into the world and see how its ethics can be seen in life in different contexts is what's interesting to me. So
Yeah,
I'll
great
end there.
stuff.
There's some other questions too, but cheers.
Thank you.
Wow, Jonathan, congratulations. What a brilliant, heartfelt body of work. Really, I just want to commend you. From the moment you arrived in the program, you brought with you this incredible tender heart, an amazingly deep curiosity, desire of unfurling, of becoming, and a lot of humility, and presence, Jonathan, presence and dedication to the EWP department, serving the community, the collective, and the individual. And I want to commend you for living into that raison d'être, right? To world making, paving the way, right? Paving the way for world making, not only as a path of apprenticeship from my perspective, but now as a way of mastery. I just felt your mastery and the decolonial, decolonial solidarity towards a world, what do they say, where many worlds fit? So congratulations, and such beautiful
Thanks.
artwork as well, Jonathan, and the clips of music and poetry and your fabulous renditions, your charts. I kind of saw them as scores, speaking to that fusion of your dedication, the fusion, the confluence of your love of music, of form, of what could we say, sacred acts of knowing. So just bowing to you, Jonathan. What a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful piece of work. Yeah. Can't wait till you're on the road and sharing this more and teaching this. And
On the road, yeah.
On the road in my
Thank you
gypsy
so much,
caravan,
Ishtar.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ishtar. And right from my first day in the department, you were there supporting and inspiring and giving just tons of space towards these kinds of questions. And I just think that it's the impact of you and the other professors in the department. I mean, it shows in the sense that the conclusion, that chart is based on my deep engagement with East-West psychology as East-West Earth world. It really
Yeah.
it was kind of, it was one of those moments when I was wondering, what is this? I knew I wanted to do some kind of a creative work for the conclusion. What is it going to be? And I was just sitting down by a river one day, and something came, and I just it just kind of almost made me laugh. That is like, of course, East, West, Earth, world. This is a musical diagram. This is, and I've
Right.
just spent all these years, in class and doing the podcast with Stefan, which has just been such a big part of who I've become. So, I mean, it's a product of love and relationality with everybody there. So,
It really
thank you
is.
so much.
Really great job. Congrats.
Cheers, Walter. Oh, oh, no, you're muted. You are maybe speaking, but
I'll try again. Thanks.
yeah. Hey, Walter.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, and thanks for such a beautiful thing and inviting me along and inviting us into this with you. It's been really wonderful to sort of hear you speak about these things and to play with you in some context and then have them to come together here. I had a couple thoughts about some things that might be helpful and a couple sort of
Please.
half question, half statements. I'm not sure whether this is the time to even sort of go over them in this moment. But there were things that occurred to me as you were talking that I thought would be interesting to hear from you about, or
Please.
later. So the first is Reagan Mitchell has a really great piece on improvisational ethics that comes from critical Black traditions and also comes from sort of a Deleuzian post-structuralist positionality that might be helpful as a way to sort of further, like a foil to further sharpen the thing that you're after.
Beautiful.
Sorry for all the metal.
Sure, beautiful.
Quick, but I'm tired. The second is Holger Scholz has a book called Sonic Fictions. And even though it's more about ethnographic spaces, that occurred to me that the autoethnographic is great. And I really appreciated this sort of autoethnographic take through things in that, the notion you can't escape the self. So you foreground the self, but it's the self as the sort of tuning fork for the world in that kind of way is a really sort of great way to think about those things. And across that, I had a couple of thoughts, questions.
Okay.
One is about the sort of movement between the universal and the particular, which is really hard to negotiate in a lot of ways, especially when we're doing work that does it simultaneously. None of the traditions are really great at talking about that. They're sort of gloss those things, right? So if we sit down to improvise together, what does it mean that we're all attuned to a thing and attuned by a thing simultaneously? And yet we go through our own sets of sensoria and our relations and experiences, and yet we're working on a thing together, right? Like that kind of is so hard to parse, and it's so hard to do. And I think there's something in there about attunements and attuning that I think is that you're leaning into, that I think you could lean into even more in that regard. That would be great. And then the other question is about sort of the inevitable slippage between what is universal about these experiences and what isn't, right? And what becomes difficult in these moments, especially for those of us who move between traditions and worlds and contexts, is that we then become quote unquote naturalized. Like the thing that the familiar becomes strange and the strange is familiar, like these sort of old saws and social stuff. that then when we become attuned to them and attuned by them, makes it more difficult for us to see what's peculiar or particular about the instance and the iteration from its universal possibilities and what we can do. And I hear you sort of wrestling at that point throughout the dissertation, right? Like how all these some sort of concentric circle maps of enter and relation, right? And talking about sort of from one hand, the deterritorializing, reterritorializing, Spinozan, how do we take particulates apart and how do we put them together? And the sort of quote unquote Eastern or more Indian sets of understanding, in this case, probably more Hindustani than Carnatic, but still sort of similar sets of notions about relation and being, right? Because both forms of improvisation have rules. And so if we're doing collective improvisation in a certain way, if you go to form, people get pissed off. And if and right, like in each of our experiences, trying to improvise in Indian quote unquote classical wisdom traditions, right? If you don't follow those traditions well, you're kicked out. So there are these sort of notions of how these sort of things move back and forth that I felt through the work. And I was wondering if you might speak to a little bit about how you're thinking about it now, because you presented the thing that you wrote, which is before. And sort of I'm wondering, as you're presenting it now and feeling about it now, how are you feeling about negotiating those things? And how are you sort of wondering about where it will take you next? I would really love to hear more about both of those things. And thanks for letting me ramble about you for a minute.
Oh, it's great. Great to have you here. Thank you for coming. And yeah, I mean, big questions. I appreciate definitely the research that you shared. I'll dig into that. And I mean, this is, so universal particular, navigating that again, like it's kind of like different lenses, different assemblages of concepts, do different things. And in terms of leaning into how, I'm, attuning myself in different ways and really how that functions. I think that's really where the value of what you're doing, I think, can be perceived in a different way as emergent. Again, so values here would be the negotiation of exactly that. It's not a value, or a moral is not a transcendental universal. Yet it is also, like Jack was saying, it's not something that is only particular. There's something and this is exactly the stakes of the trans individual. So I think that's exactly it. I mean, I'm not sure how long I should go on, but
No.
I think that I just want to say, like, I couldn't unpack William Parker's universal tonality, but when he says universal tonality is another name for love, it's kind of like he's throwing that out there as, here's a future attractor. What is love to you? I mean, again, it can sound a little bit, I mean, it's definitely poetic, but it can sound like he's kind of bypassing the philosophical stakes of what universal tonality could be. But I actually think he's placing it in the affective, in the music. It's in the doing. It's in the experience. And I think that notion of love is it's a matter of discovering love anew in every single moment. It's not something that is a fixed feeling or something. It's like that attunement to the universal particular. And I guess I could give some examples of, in my own case, that vertical access, which comes in terms of like a self and divine, for instance. It's like there's different kinds of there's a way in which the raga actually accesses this vertical access, and it goes from emotional feeling, which is called a bhav. So you play the raga and it starts to elicit emotions, human emotions, and a lot of this the ragas are describing human emotions for a loved one, the pathos of the not having a loved one return, for instance. But also they describe love, a divine type of love. And in terms of how the raga functions almost on an alchemical level, at a certain point, if you do the sonal ritual correctly, I mean, if you tune yourself to the sonal ritual, the raga descends and you get to this aesthetic kind of rupture point where the bhav, the human emotions, become sublime emotions, basically, like some kind of a sublime. And that would be, you could say in the Indian language or integral yoga, it would be a kind of bliss. So that's like, bliss is different than emotional love, for instance. And so that's where I think that this, William Parker's idea, it's a question. It's a problematic term in the positive sense of, at every moment, question what this is and open to it in anew, and see what values kind of come up in how you attune between a universal and a particular in that experience.
And I would just say that, like, letting that tension rest. I saw the committee come in, so I just wanted to stop briefly. But like, not resolving that tension, I think, is really
Yeah.
significant, right?
Yeah.
Like the tendency to make it a thing rather than just thank you.
Right, which is exactly where, and that's in my own trajectory where a heterocultural, that's where it helped, that framing has helped me express that exactly. Yes, I see the three have
Yeah, we're
turned.
back, Jonathan. And as you can see, it took us a long time because of the richness of your dissertation, and the amount that we had to deliberate about
Too much.
matters about heaven and earth. But we just wanted to say congratulations. You passed your dissertation with some minor changes. And so we'll convey the minor changes, but that's it. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Debashish, Jack.
Congratulations!
Congratulations,
Woo!
John.
Woo!
Wow.
Yes,
Dr.
thank you,
K.
everybody.
John, I,
Yes, sir.
I am Kola. You remember?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah. I'm so happy that I'm able to witness this. I was actually very nervous for you at the beginning because being that I am still writing up my paper and I know that you will be working and helping me out at a point. I just want to say warm congratulations on this successful defense. You see, your work is not only a formidable intellectual achievement, but it is also a deeply felt exploration of the power sonic particles hold to dissolve and reconfigure identities across cultural boundaries. Your autoethnographic journey from jazz through raga beautifully illuminates the notions of the transindividual and your engagement with Deleuze's thought, particularly the idea that learning emerges through disruptive encounters with intensities was nothing short of galvanizing. I'm especially struck by your use of the mandala of becoming as a structuring principle. It speaks to a kind of non-linear epistemology that I have also been wrestling with in my own research on juju music and the sonic identities of Yoruba drama. We had a bit of discussion on this when we were in London. Where I explore how Africanizing digital technology can resist the westernization of African performance culture. So your defense gave me a language to reimagine aspects of my work, not least the idea of rupture and becoming through musical encounter as part of a broader sonocultural transindividuation. I hope to develop parts of this into postdoctoral research, and I will really value your thoughts, especially around crafting academic language that holds both philosophical rigor and lived musical intensity. Observing this today kind of gives me, some courage and hope because I will be facing my own panel too, hopefully by the end of this academic year. But thank you very much. I'm happy that I'm able to witness this. Congratulations.
Cheers. Thanks for coming, Kola. And yes, your work is also very inspiring and engaging with a similar problematic from different perspectives. But yeah, we'll definitely look forward to working with you as well again. And
It's fantastic.
yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you.
So I think, yeah, so maybe where are we in this defense? We've gone a little bit over. I know that I don't see Debashish anymore, but Jack, and Stephen, I want to thank you. I think at this point, then everything is officially done after your deliberation. So the two of you are free to go as you need to. And we'll continue to be in touch with the revisions. And yes, I have time to do some of those. And so I just want to thank you once again for your support and
Huge
and all the help.
congratulations, Jonathan.
Yeah, cheers.